Stanford University.
The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
I thought I'd begin with a full-page ad that appeared in an Italian newspaper in the summer of 2010. The ad was put out by an Italian clothing designer named Carlo Chiona, who happens to own a clothing brand. It's not a very well-known one, but it's a clothing brand named 9.2, whose garments are produced entirely in Italy. Now, Chiona, by the way, imposed his own face on the top of the body of the gladiator. I don't know whose body that is. Maybe it's Russell Crowe's. But there he is standing outside of the Colosseum. And he paid €2 million to publicize this campaign, which he called In Defense of Made in Italy. Now, in that poster, the l'italico at the top actually it's the way you refer to Italy at the time of the Roman Empire. And the text at the bottom says, I will do everything to save Made in Italy. Stop, reflect, think it over. The most important thing is to know that what you are buying is Italian. Right? Remember that Made in Italy lives only because of the choices we make. Now, I don't know if Chiona was intentionally injecting some humor into this debate by portraying himself as a Roman gladiator, but his ad was merely the latest salvo in a very public debate that has been going on in Italy for at least the last 2 decades. It's a debate over the overseas production of Made in Italy, clothing as well as other kinds of products. Now, the debate is closely linked to, and sometimes confused with, another debate that's been going on about the production in China of fake or counterfeit products, including Italian designer brands. Right? Now, for example, it's been reported in the Italian newspapers that there are at least 26 fake Valentino brands being sold in China. There's Bruno Valentino, Giuseppe Valentino, Claudio Valentino, and so on, right? And in Hangzhou, China, for example, there's a company that makes fake Valentino products that are actually sold in the original Valentino boxes purchased from the company in Italy. So it's a very complicated, confusing field out there in trying to figure out what is counterfeit and what is real. Now, many Italians are incensed by the production and sale of these fakes. And in the 1990s, or since the 1990s, there have been a lot of campaigns against what is considered to be the unlawful exploitation of the Made in Italy label. And these campaigns have been launched by regional governments, labor unions, and business associations in Italy. Now, the sale of counterfeit products complete with seemingly authentic labels is, of course, hardly new to Italy, right? Nor to China, nor to many areas of the world. Italy has long abounded in counterfeit products. It used to be said, that those products always came from the south, from the Naples area, for example. But this campaign to identify genuine Made in Italy products, right, and to restrict the use of the Made in Italy label shifts the focus from the faking of a brand to faking the national location of the manufacturing of the product. Now, this campaign then also raises some very sticky issues for Italian textile and garment manufacturers who have outsourced production to countries such as China. And it reveals a couple of ironies that underlie the global success of Italian fashion in the last 30 years. Now, first of all, the decade in which Italian fashion really took off and became a global success story was the 1980s. And this success was due in good part to the Made in Italy marketing campaign launched by the Italian Trade Association. Now, in case you aren't familiar with that campaign, let me give you an example of its latest iteration. In the spring of 2009, the Italian Trade Commission announced that it had recruited, quote, iconic Italian-born actress, model, and entrepreneur Isabella Rossellini as a spokesperson for the new Made in Italy advertising campaign to be presented in the United States. In their press announcement, the Trade Commission states, quote, "In this new campaign, Isabella Rossellini challenges Americans to let yourself be charmed by an Italian, highlighting the perfect style and passion for handcrafted detail that makes Italian products so special and unmistakable." And the actress herself is quoted as saying, "Italian style signifies quality, quality gained from centuries of work by artists and artisans and combined with Italian charm, humor, and warmth." Now, just as it did in the 1980s when this campaign first started, this current campaign for Made in Italy trumpets the Italianness captured in these products. And it evokes an Italian artisanal and craft tradition that can be traced back at least as far as the Renaissance. Now, and so all of this endows these products with a rich cultural heritage and, of course, also legitimates their high price. Now, the 1980s, when all of this began, however, was the same decade in which Italian textile and garment manufacturers began exporting phases of production overseas to countries such as China, Korea, India, the Philippines, and then later Romania. Now, by the 1990s, the increasingly favorable environment for foreign investment and trade this was created by the Chinese government, of course, made China the most favorite site for the outsourcing of almost all the phases of textile and clothing manufacturing, certainly for the Italians and for many, many other countries, including the United States. Now, so there's this irony, right, that just in the decade in which Made in Italy was becoming famous globally, it was actually being outsourced. Production was being outsourced to other countries. The second irony is that Made in Italy fashion was created not by relying on artisanal production, but rather by replacing artisanal production with industrial production. In other words, this 1980s model was founded on a form of what's sometimes referred to as industrial fashion. Now, in the beginning of the 1980s, it was initially Florentine luxury, ready-to-wear designers with aristocratic names like Marchese Emilio Pucci, who challenged the French hegemony in high fashion. But soon after this, Italian fashion moved from Florence, which was, of course, the city of Renaissance Italy, to Milan, which is the commercial center and the industrial center. So the result was a ready-to-wear fashion associated with what some fashion historians call the industrial aesthetics of the Fabulous Four. Now, the Fabulous Four, which emerged in this era, were, of course, Giorgio Armani, Gianfranco Ferré, Missoni, and finally Crizia. Now, what these designers and entrepreneurs did was they created Made in Italy by combining clothing designs with a sizing system that was suitable for industrial production. That was really what they forged in the 1980s. Now, what I'm going to talk about today draws on anthropological research that I've been conducting for about the last 6 years or so on contemporary collaborations between Italians and Chinese in the global fashion industry. And as Susan mentioned, last year I was able to devote full time to writing the book, which is based on this research, because I was a fellow here at the Humanities Center, which of course gave me precious time off from teaching. Now, this research that I'm going to talk about today builds on previous research that I conducted on family firms in the silk industry of Como, Italy. Now, that was a study about family business and about the textile manufacturing sector. At the same time that I was doing that research, another anthropologist named Lisa Roffel, who is an expert on China, was conducting research on a state-owned silk factory in Hangzhou, China. So in the course of our respective investigations, we began to realize that there were important links between our research sites and that one day we should study the transnational business relations between Chinese and Italians, right? For one thing, even in the 1980s and 90s, before outsourcing began, Italian silk production relied on the importation of raw silk from China, because they had stopped producing their own raw silk around the 1930s. Now, I want to say something here about why an anthropologist would be interested in such a topic, because I suspect that many of you might have a different idea of what anthropologists study. Actually, are there any of you here who ever took an anthropology course at Stanford? Oh, a few. Great. And anyway, those of you who did take a course in cultural or social anthropology probably had a rather different kind of course, unless it was quite recently, like within the last 10 years, right? And you were probably introduced to anthropology as the comparative study of cultures, right? In particular, the study of diverse cultures throughout the world. So what we might call the Margaret Mead version of cultural anthropology was an attempt to study human cultural variability. So the idea is, look at all the different societies around the world and do intensive studies of different cultures, each of which has a distinct system of values or meanings, rituals, and forms of social relations. Now, in the last couple of decades, of course, anthropologists have noted that we have to deal with the increasing flow of people and ideas and objects throughout the globe. And that's heightened our interest in processes of cultural formation, in other words, the formation of culture and ideas about society that actually transcend cultural and national boundaries. Okay? Now, as we began to study these processes, we began to realize that societies that we had often treated as if they were distinct cultural systems actually had been formed in relationship with other cultures, right? So that cultural interaction and cultural relations, including trade and business relations, had been crucial to shaping what we think of as distinctive cultures throughout the world. So one of the key questions that I'm asking in this research is, how do the Italians and the Chinese who participate in these transnational business collaborations themselves get reshaped as cultural actors along with the commodities that they're producing? In other words, it's not just the material objects that are being refashioned, right? But it's the people engaged in the production of those objects that are themselves being changed by these processes. So this, in my set, this would include everyone from Italian firm owners to their family members, Chinese entrepreneurs, Italian and Chinese managers, Italian technicians, and Chinese factory workers. So the study attempts to include all of those people in this process and try to figure out what's happening to them as they engage in these business relations. Now, our research has taken place primarily in two sites. One is, let me go back, well, let's start here with northern Italy. This is the site where I conducted my initial research in Italy. It's the Como Milan area, which is the home of the Italian silk industry. And this is also the site from which several of the firms that I followed to China originate. So that's one of the sites, and the other site is the eastern coast of China around Shanghai. And as you may already know, that area has served as one of the central locations for foreign investment in China, especially with regard to labor-intensive industries like textiles and clothing production. Now, I just want to make it clear that, again, to emphasize that I wasn't studying artisanal family firms when I was doing the research in Como, Milan. And let me give you some slides that show you the kind of industrial manufacturing of textiles, of silk, that takes place there. Usually when I talk about family firms in the silk industry of Italy, a lot of people think it's still artisanal production, but it has been industrial since the 1890s. So you can see the scale and, of course, the incredibly expensive machinery that's being used in these weaving, in the production of textiles. I also like to show this so that people know that I wasn't just hanging around cafes on the side of the lake. I don't know if any of you have been to Lake Como. Most people know Bellagio, which is a very beautiful sort of resort area. So I know my colleagues always think that that's just all I've been doing. But in fact, I've been in these very difficult industrial sites. Right. Now, the Italian firms that are engaged in these transnational collaborations range from those that are producing textiles and clothing priced for the middle level of the fashion market, okay? But it also includes very well-known luxury brands that some of you might even be familiar with, not only Armani, but Ermenegildo Zegna, Perla, parts of the Marzotto group, which includes Missoni and Ferré. Now, although Italian textile and clothing firms initially outsourced production to China to get cheap labor, right? This is what, as we've been doing this study over the last 8 years, it's been very interesting to watch the shift in what is going on between Italy and China. Because today, Italian fashion brands want, most of all, to sell their products in China. Okay? So this makes China a very different kind of country to which they are outsourcing production. It's not like Romania, where they are outsourcing manufacturing to, but they are not relying on Romania to save them from, let's say, the financial crisis and the decline in sales that has gone on in Europe and the United States. So China has become, over the last few years, the most important market for Italian luxury brands. Okay, so it's a very complicated situation at this point. Now, it's not only the leading luxury brands that are trying to make it in China, but also lesser brands and names that you would never have heard of. And they also consider China the market that's going to enable them to survive and expand. So the transformation of China from a country to which production is outsourced to one that is viewed as crucial as a market is changing these relations between Italian firms and their partners. Now, made in China, and all the time in Italy you hear this, that made in China is becoming increasingly made for China. Now, the popularity of Italian fashion in China is visibly displayed in major Chinese cities such as Shanghai by the presence of Italian luxury brands. So, for example, the Ermenegildo Zegna firm, they've been there since the 1990s. They've been selling in China since the 1990s, but about 3 or 4 years ago, they opened a very large flagship store in Shanghai. I mean, it's something like 4 stories high. There's also an abundance of Chinese clothing. This is actually another Italian chain in China, Motivi. If people have been to Italy, you've probably seen many of them. It's part of an even larger conglomerate of retail chains owned by the Meroglio family. But this is one of their brands. This one actually is for kind of mid-level women's clothing. But in addition to these Italian chains, there are also an abundance of Chinese clothing stores with Italian-sounding names because Italian clothing brands have a certain cachet. And so you have something like Giordano, which is actually a Hong Kong brand with an Italian name, and that's their store in Suzhou, China. There are also stores like this one, Capitalism, which sounds Italian, all right, but obviously they made a slight error. It should be Capitano, but it works, right? So there are all these kinds of stores that look like Italian stores that are not necessarily. This is my favorite store in Shanghai, Luxury Capitalist. Now, then there are real Italian-Chinese joint ventures, such as the ones that I've been studying. So this is a joint Italian clothing brand in Shanghai called Elegant Prosper, which is it's interesting that they made the name a English name, even though it's an Italian-Chinese joint venture, and Elegant Prosper is the English translation of the name that the Chinese partners picked that was, I guess, works really well in the Chinese characters, maybe not so well as Elegant Prosper. It's an awkward name, but that's the name of the chain, and it's quite successful. Now, as regards these Italian-Chinese collaborations, obviously we're talking about partners who have very different kinds of histories, different ownership structures, and so you have a very interesting set of relations to negotiate between them. Perhaps the most significant difference is that the vast majority of Italian fashion brands and textile and clothing firms are family firms. In other words, they're owned and managed by families. And there's nothing unusual about that, because about 80% of the manufacturing done in Italy is done by family firms. Right? Family firms are a major form of economic form, business form in Italy. Now, some of the Chinese firms with which they collaborate are also family firms, right? But others are complex combinations of public and private ownership. Now, many firms and businesses in China are sponsored by government entities, right? So it may be a township, it may be a province, it may be the national government. So although China has steadily moved away from a centrally planned economy to a more market-based, decentralized, and somewhat privatized one, the Chinese government remains a dominant figure in the market economy. So when people talk about business enterprise in China, it's not always easily to translate what we think of as a business here to China, because you have these very interesting public-private partnerships, so that you might have somebody from the Communist Party who represents the party in the firm and makes sure that the interests of the party are being met. So you don't have, in all cases, what we would consider private business. Right? Now, the organizational structure of Italian family firms generally follows a kind of patriarchal structure in which the head of the family, which is usually the father, makes decisions, and he may start to consult with his children as they grow older. Usually those are sons, but there are also daughters, increasingly daughters involved in management of these family firms, primarily because the birth rate in Italy fell quite rapidly after the 1950s, and so there are many families in which there are no sons, right? So daughters end up taking over. There are complex issues of inheritance that I won't go in here, but it is useful to know also that in Italy, as in France, there is an inheritance system that is very different from the United States. In other words, in Italy, which follows the Napoleonic system since the 19th century, inheritance, family inheritance, the patrimony has to be divided equally among all children. Okay, so you are not supposed to discriminate on the basis of gender, and parents can't just give their money away to whomever they like. There are set proportions that you must give your money to your children. So among these family firms, strategies of capital accumulation, firm expansion, and diversification, along with the organization of management, are shaped by ideas about the family, about gender, about personhood, about love, commitment, solidarity, and the whole bundle of ideas that govern families. Now, because they're outside the family, a manager who is hired by the family will be given a limited role in management. Right? And those managers, those outside managers, rarely ascend to the highest levels of management because those are reserved for members of the family and for the children. Now, often what happens is that when the children in a family firm are relatively young, a professional outside manager might be given a fairly large role. But that almost always leads to disappointment, because at the moment at which the children get old enough to take over the firm, then the firm is handed over to them. So when I was writing about this in my book on Italian family firms, I realized that you could say that they hit a kind of kinship glass ceiling, right? You don't go beyond a certain level if you're not a member of the family. Now, the expansion of the family firm into China, however, has created new opportunities for these non-family members. Okay? Because as lucrative as China has become as both a market and a site of production, it's still considered by Italian family firms to be a kind of cultural hinterland. And it's a difficult place for them to adjust to live in. So members of the owning family usually limit their stays to China, their stays in China to short visits of up to, let's say, 2 weeks, right? So as a consequence, Italian family firms doing business in China have to rely increasingly on non-family managers. Now, I'm sorry I don't have any photos of the Italian managers, which I can't take pictures of them because of issues of confidentiality, and I never use their names, and I always have to always use pseudonyms, which is what anthropologists do. And it's somewhat of a shame because some of these managers look like they were sent by Hollywood Central Casting to play the part of the Italian manager of a luxury brand. There's some amazing looking people there. And partly they have been, in a sense, because they're representing the brand, they're representing the firm, and they're supposed to somehow embody all of the attributes of the firm and what it has to offer. But we can look at the suits, at least. Now, these managers occupy a range of positions. Some of them are working with their Chinese partners to set up a whole manufacturing process or to set up a management structure. Some of them are directing production in factories in China. Some are marketing franchises for Italian designer brands, and some are recruiting Chinese manufacturers to collaborate in joint ventures with Italian firms. Now, very few of these managers speak Mandarin, nor do they speak the local dialect. And so they have to use the services of Chinese translators who translate from Mandarin or a regional dialect, Chinese dialect, to Italian. Okay? But more often than not, the Italian managers and the Chinese partners and their staff communicate in English, because that's the language that they're most likely to both be able to understand, right? We might say that they communicate in business, what they call business English, because some of it would be not terribly recognizable to everyone. And one of the things that is pretty funny is that each side complains about how bad the other side's English is. Now, the managers are predominantly male, although not exclusively, and they're young. Most of them are between the ages of 24 and 35. And most of these men and women have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. Many of them have college degrees in what we would consider business. It's called economy and commerce. Right? Some of them might have more technical degrees, but for the most part, they've been trained in business. Now, in spite of the challenges of living in China, managers view the career opportunity offered there as far superior to what they see as available to them in China. So they point to the slow rate of economic growth in Europe and the United States, in contrast to what, at least until recently, was a 10% growth rate in China. And so obviously they're involved in a much more exciting career there than they would be in Italy, where they're closing down stores. Now, the managers are generally quite positive about the technical skills of their Chinese factory workers, and they describe them as being very skillful at adapting Italian machines to the local production needs. They see them as very quick to learn computing tasks and so on. But when it comes to the Chinese managers and entrepreneurs, the Italian managers are much less complimentary. Now, they acknowledge that their Chinese partners have invaluable knowledge that is necessary for dealing with the Chinese market, and above all, for knowing how to negotiate through the multiple levels of the Chinese government. The bureaucratic needs of these firms are large, right? But they have a bevy of complaints about their Chinese partners and their shortcomings. Among these are, they are quite adamant about the poor planning skills of their Chinese partners and what they see as their lack of initiative in problem solving, their inflexibility, and their lack of creativity. Now, I should say that we're talking about what the Italians think of the Chinese. I'm not going to even go into what the Chinese think about the Italians here. That's a whole nother story. But many of these complaints are not specific to the fashion industry. In fact, I don't know if any of you have friends who worked in China, but these are very common complaints among Americans and Europeans who work in business in China. Okay? Now, many of these, of course, also reflect widespread Western stereotypes of China. Now, Italy did not have colonial projects in China or other areas of Asia, but Italians are, after all, well steeped in 19th and 20th century Western colonial views of the Far East, right? And Italy, another thing you must know is Italy is at the same time dealing with the recent arrival of Chinese immigrants in Italy itself. Okay? So, I mean, Italy has what many Italians consider that they have an immigration problem, even though immigrants are a pretty small segment of the Italian population still, much smaller than in France or Spain or certainly in England and the United States. But in some ways, you could say that Italians are still reeling from the shock that they're a country bringing in immigrants as opposed to a country exporting immigrants to other societies. So there's a lot of adjustment going on in Italy with this right now. And among the groups that have shown up in the last 20 years and gotten a lot more publicity in the last 10 are Chinese immigrants. So for example, there is a community of 20,000 Chinese in the city of Prato, which is 10 kilometers outside of Florence, right? And that's now they make up about 1/5 of the population. And that was a big textile manufacturing town. So there is a presence there that is not exactly easy for a lot of Italians to deal with. So some of these complaints that they have about the Chinese partners are almost expected, right? But there are other complaints that are more specific to the sector of production and distribution in which they are working, right? Now, the most common complaint is that Chinese lack fashion sense, right? According to Italian managers, it's going to be a long time before the Chinese are up to understanding the sensibilities and semiotics of Western fashion. So they say, the Chinese are still in the phase of copying, much like the Japanese were in the 1980s. And it's going to take another generation or more before Chinese will be able to move past this. So if Chinese consumers aren't enthusiastic about the newest colors and styles in Italian fashion trends, the Italian managers say it's because they have to be taught a more modern fashion sensibility. If Chinese customers are too focused on comfort, they have to realize, as one Italian manager told me, that to be fashionable, you can't dress like you're going to the gym. Right? So given the underdeveloped state of Chinese fashion, Italian managers feel that they're crucial to guaranteeing the quality control, the brand management, and effective marketing of their products. And above all, managers feel that they have to be really vigilant to maintain the quality and prestige of the brand. Now, the need for brand management is all the more crucial, according to Italian managers, because the Chinese just don't know what colors and fabrics go together, right? So, and they also lack a kind of skill in visual merchandising. In other words, they don't know how to make a collection, and they don't know how to put together different articles of clothing to make attractive window displays and floor displays. So unlike Italians, who these managers say are used to wearing fashionable clothing, Chinese don't have this intuitive flair for fashion. Now, according to Italian managers, the Chinese themselves recognize that they have this underdeveloped fashion sense, And that's evidenced in their willingness to follow suggestions from sales clerks when they go into stores, right? So they're seen as very gullible because a Italian store clerk or even a Chinese store clerk in an Italian fashion brand can sell them a lot of things because they can insist that if you're going to buy this, you have to buy this, and you have to buy this, right? In Italy, in contrast, people say customers go into the store to purchase just one item. And I have a lot of Italian friends who are very proud of the fact that they do this, that they go in, they purchase one item, and then they figure out that they have the fashion sensibility to put that together with something else, and therefore be creative in their own clothing. But that's because Italians say they have confidence in their fashion sense. Now, it's interesting. I expected at first to find gender differences on this subject. But in fact, both male and female Italian managers say that they have this fashion sense. And for instance, a male manager said to me, well, since I'm Italian, I've always known about fashion. Now, above all, then, Chinese can't be trusted to preserve the brand's Italianità. In other words, its Italianness. Now, and this includes not only the quality of the manufactured product, but the design features that convey what they view as the Italianness of the brand. So in the view of Italian production managers, Chinese production supervisors and workers simply don't have the ability to recognize the small but crucial details of Italianità. And so what they mean by that are things like the positioning of a pocket or the alignment of a zipper, right? And likewise, even while they concede that the Chinese managers have a better understanding of the Chinese market, Italian distribution managers see them as falling short of knowing how to effectively market Italianità in China. Now, it's not that the Italian managers biologize this Italianness, right? They don't mean that they're genetically Italian. Although every once in a while somebody will say something like it's in our DNA, right? But I think they mean that metaphorically. They don't mean that it's genetic. They mean it's cultural, right? But when they say cultural, they don't mean something that can be taught formally in school or through business training, right? None of them these managers spoke about Italianità as something that they acquired through schooling or on-the-job training, right? Instead, they talked more about how they acquired a kind of intuitive feeling for design and fashion, and more broadly for a kind of aesthetic, right, just by growing up in Italy. Now, given that the market value of the clothing produced is inextricably linked to its Italianness, it's then not surprising that the Italians would view their labor as more crucial and valuable than the labor of Chinese. But what I find interesting is that in the production of Made in Italy in China, it's the Italian managers who've become the surrogates of Italian workers. So in other words, although Made in Italy in the marketing campaign highlights the artisanal craft and skill of Italian workers, in the transnational production of Made in Italy in China, it's the Italian managers who've become responsible for infusing these commodities with Italian charm. Now, let me just say a teeny bit about the Chinese managers and entrepreneurs. There's a whole nother side to the story, obviously, and more of that is being written by my colleague, Lisa Roffel, because she's the sinologist and she knows the whole history of business, labor, family, and all of these issues in China. But one of the interesting things that we first both realized about the Chinese entrepreneurs and managers in these joint ventures is that, first of all, like the Italian managers, they're quite young, right? So, for example, the brothers who have partnered with a prestigious Italian brand to produce a parallel line for international distribution, these guys are in their early 40s, and they're considered old to be in this sector, right? Most of the other Chinese managers in this fashion sector are under the age of 30. Right? Now, some of them, like these brothers who are involved with this Italian family firm are themselves a family firm. Okay, so you have this very interesting situation of Italian family firm meets Chinese family firm. And in fact, the Italians specifically look for family firms with which to partner. Many of them have had very difficult experiences in the early years of coming to China, working with state companies, and they pretty uniformly say they don't want to have anything to do with them. They feel like they understand family firms, even if they are Chinese family firms. But family firms are only one of the types of businesses with whom these Italians are collaborating. The majority of the young Chinese managers and entrepreneurs who work for and with Italian firms are not the products of entrepreneurial families. Well, not surprising, since, of course, China opened up to Western capitalism only in the last 30 years. So there is no history there of them having worked for their parents or being able to take over their firms. So what you have is a cohort of freshly minted college graduates that have entered into business, very eager to learn about Western firms, right? So those in textile and manufacturing are especially keen on learning about retailing, branding, advertising, how to design fashion that appeals to Western tastes. Many have been educated in China's business schools, which moved very quickly from teaching Marxist economics to Keynesian and neoliberal economic theory. So one of the things that was surprising was when I went to the business school, I thought maybe I'd see, a picture of Marx or something, but in fact, there was the pictures of John Maynard Keynes and other kinds of people that we think of as the big economic theorists of the West. Now, one of the schools that they have been trained in, especially in the textile and clothing industry, is Donghua University in Shanghai, which was previously a textile manufacturing college, but now also prepares students in fashion design, fashion merchandising, branding, and so on. Right? So the decision by these young Chinese entrepreneurs to go into business is commonly motivated, at least they say so, by a desire not just to make money, right, but also many of them say they want to avoid the inefficiencies, the constraints, and burdens of working with the state sector. So they say, rather than rely on my parents' kinship and friendship networks in the Communist Party to get jobs in the public sector, I want to do it on my own. And they have very much absorbed, many of them, this idea of a kind of entrepreneurial individualism. They also rely a lot on their peers, on their college classmates, to help them forge paths to success. Now, as they are working for Italian clothing and textile firms, these young Chinese entrepreneurs are, interestingly enough, learning that not all Western capitalist firms work the way that they were taught in business school. Right? Now, in the case of working with Italian family firms, of course, what they're learning is that Italian capitalism is itself shaped by bonds of family and kinship. So, for example, one of the women we work very closely with, called Emily, is a very bright, personable, ambitious young woman in her early 30s who worked for several years for an Italian entrepreneur who arranges garment production in China for several very well-known European designer brands. Now, so her position and that of her boss, the firm that they have, is a kind of middleman position, right? And Italian brands come to them and say, find us the right factory, the right manufacturers who can produce this kind of product. And you have to have a lot of local knowledge to know which factories can do knitwear, which factories can do this kind of weaving, which factories can do this kind of clothing production. Now, Emily's expectation has been that once her boss, who's now in his early 70s, retires, she would take over his clients. But then a couple of years ago, to her dismay, he brought his son into the business. Now, the son had never been to China, never set foot into China, and the boss had always complained about how this son was just a playboy and wouldn't do any work and was no good. But at the last minute, he brought his son into the firm and displaced Emily, right? So what Emily has just learned is this painful lesson that she didn't realize, that she too could hit the kinship glass ceiling. Right? So it's hardly the case that Italian firms are exporting to China a Western Western business model that's oriented solely towards profit making. Right? Instead, we have a rising generation of aspiring Chinese entrepreneurs who are encountering a form of family capitalism, a Western family capitalism, where they had been taught that they were going to find these kinds of efficient, rational business firms. Now, there isn't an end to this story of the transnational business encounters along what I have been calling the 21st century Silk Road. Since Italian firms began moving their production to China, as I've pointed out, these relations of marketing and production and distribution have changed more quickly than anyone could have imagined. Right? Now, also, we know now that whereas the Chinese government's major strategy in the early 1990s was to encourage vast amounts of foreign investment geared mainly towards export, right, by providing low-cost labor, their most recent strategy has been to raise the wages of workers, encourage domestic consumption among growing Chinese middle class, and support the development of a knowledge economy and what they call the culture industries along the lines of the United States and Europe. So they are no more interested in supporting the kinds of work that textile and clothing production entails. Now, Italian firms in the fashion industry are both hopeful and anxious about these changes. Right? On the one hand, given the rapid growth in the consumption of Italian fashion in China, they view the Chinese market as the savior of made in Italy. Right? In fact, if it weren't for the Chinese market and also the Russian market right now, Italian fashion firms would be in very difficult straits. And that's especially true of the luxury brands, right? So the highest, most costly luxury brands are selling now at least half of their products in China. On the other hand, they're very anxious that as their Chinese partners learn more about Western taste and design, branding and marketing, that they're going to take over more and more of the global fashion market. So if we go back to the poster by the clothing designer Carlo Chiona, we can see that the Italian fashion industry is all too well aware that the barbarians are already at the gates of Rome.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.